How are attitudes measured? Social psychologists attempt to study attitudes through measurement. The most common way is through self-report measures that ask people directly about their attitudes. A single item rarely captures the complexity of an attitude, and so psychologists use multiple items called attitude scales. They often use items with a Likert scale. For example, how satisfied are you with this? What do you think about this? Or, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend? Collectively, these items tell us more about the attitude than any one of them alone. We also know that people don't always tell the truth, especially when responding to topics that are sensitive or controversial. In some situations, researchers use the bogus pipeline technique to convince participants that their responses are being verified by a polygraph in real time. In one study, Tourangeau and colleagues found that compared to the control group, people hooked up to the polygraph admitted to using more drugs and alcohol, engaging in more oral sex, and not exercising enough. So it does work, but social psychologists take great care in terms of when and how it's used. Here's an example of an attitude scale by Templer and colleagues. It's called the PET attitude scale. You would rate your agreement with each statement using 1 to 5, or 0 to 3, or some other range. The responses from many people are then correlated with other measures to examine the relationships between attitudes, emotions, and behaviors. Social psychologists also use more covert measures to collect information that is not easily controlled and that is assumed to be an indicator of attitudes. For example, they might observe participants' behaviors, such as their facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. If someone crosses their arms or frowns while discussing a topic, or while listening to someone else talk about it, that might be an indication that they have a negative attitude about that topic. They also measure physiological arousal, like heart rate, perspiration, eye movements, and facial muscle movements, or brain activity using electroencephalograph or functional magnetic resonance imaging. Or they may try to measure association reaction times with an implicit association test. Let's take a look at a few of these examples on the next few slides. Here's an example of an fMRI machine that records electrical activity in the brain while participants view or listen to various stimuli, like photographs of people or recordings of persuasive speeches. Recall that attitudes have an emotion-oriented component. The evidence for this lies in some very interesting fMRI studies where the areas of the brain that are typically associated with emotion are activated in response to evaluative stimuli. The facial electromyograph, or EMG for short, is an electronic instrument that records facial muscle activity, not observable to the naked eye, associated with emotions and attitudes, shown here in Figure 6.2 from the textbook. Certain muscles in the cheeks, for example, contract when we are happy, and different muscles contract when we are sad. By recording these movements, social psychologists make inferences about what someone thinks and feels about a topic. Here is an illustration of an electroencephalograph, or EEG. A web-like cap with dozens of electrodes is placed on the scalp and used to record electrical activity in the brain, which is represented by the waves on the reading. When presented with certain stimuli, our brain waves change, and these changes are used to infer attitudes. This is a less expensive and more accessible alternative to fMRI. And finally, the implicit association test. You learned about IATs in the previous lecture. These tests compare the speed with which people respond to pairings of concepts across many trials. When a pair of words matches our implicit attitudes, we respond faster. For instance, by measuring how quickly people respond to young and good versus old and bad, compared to young and bad versus old and young. The challenge with measuring implicit attitudes is, by definition, we are not aware of having them. So it's difficult to verify or confirm their existence. There is some research that suggests explicit attitudes are more predictive of our behavior than implicit attitudes. At this point, we've defined attitudes and reviewed some of the ways social psychologists measure them. In the next part, we'll explore the question of whether attitudes predict behavior.